It's showtime. I think we're live, sis.
I think we are.
Putting up for you. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you. I need
Cleaning the show off is it's kind of dirty today, huh?
Hey, you speak for yourself. I don't know what you got going on there.
So
In the desert with the mountains and the
that's just, a motif.
Yes, it's beautiful.
I'm doing some real deep work on that. I've got a new platform kind of for us to put all this together a little differently. We get some better backgrounds, some different things. Until all that comes to fruition, we'll go with what we got for now. But we will be changing that. So anyway, hey everybody, sorry for chit chatting and jaw jabbing. Welcome to Red Hoop Talk. My name is Roy, and this is my sister Shannon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Welcome. We'd first like to thank the first people of our land that we stand. Shannon, would you like to say something first?
Yes, I'm grateful for the land I'm standing on the Piscataway people and the many tribes of the Northeast that walk this way through Maryland. And what about you, Roy?
The many tribes that exist here in Southern California.
Yes.
Because I butcher the names every single time.
Yeah, someone has got to come on and help Roy understand California Indian.
There's not enough of them around. Every time I'm local at a gathering or a powwow or a backyard drum meeting or something, there's they're all from somewhere else, either from Oklahoma, or we're from up north, or somewhere. Everybody's from somewhere else in California. There's not a lot of natives, let alone native Californians, but native people out here, so from here that I run into anyway. But
right. Look at where you are. I mean, you're not that far from Saboba. You're not that far from, tribes down south in San Diego, like the Changa and San Manuel and the Valley. And I mean,
when I get down that way, I do run into folks at that point when you go down to Saboba or whatever.
The Kauai and Tongva.
And what's bad this year is we lost all our powwows, so nobody's meeting. They're doing these like the bird singers are doing. They're going around parking lots and doing shows and stuff, and that's cool. Like they're having singing groups. Like they'll go just to like a Kohl's parking lot, and then they'll have the bird singers go there and they'll perform or do their thing. So they've been trying to have some type of interaction, but it's been hard, because all the powwows were canceled. So we got nothing this year, nothing.
Yeah. Well, what are the gourd dancers doing anything, or how are people staying connected out there?
So Golden State Gourd Dance Society hasn't had anything yet. I've been watching their website to see if I can, find something. But haven't yet. So I'm hoping that soon somebody says something that, hey, we're going to meet here, we're going to do that or something. It'd be nice to get with those fellas again.
Well, let's say hi to some people. I see SP has joined us, Sandra and Victoria from Colorado, and then my son you see there, Wolfman Wolf. And I think I'm supposed to shout out, subscribe, like, and comment to Wolfman Wolf on YouTube.
You're showing your son's link on our show.
But he's the one who's helping me with all my technology on this side.
Everybody like, comment, and subscribe on the Wolfman show, because he is helping his mom handle business. Because without that, we wouldn't have her on here. That is faux show.
Yes. So I appreciate his Choctaw understanding of technology. And what else have we got going on? We have a wonderful guest for you today, Santee Frazier, who's from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, who's an amazing author and poet. We're going to get in some interesting discussions I'm excited about.
It seems like every time we bring another guest on, I get dumber and dumber and dumber. It's like It's like, really, why do we have to? There's so many intelligent people out there that we've been bringing on. It's just, I mean, just talking to these folks is like changing my whole level of existence. I'm like, oh boy, I'm going to drop another rung after this one, you know? So I'm glad that I get to just sit here and let them do the talking because, you know, anyway.
Yes, that is
All right.
cool.
So do you have any news, anything going on out there that you want to?
We've been having a lot of men on the show. It's been really masculine around here. So I had to like put some makeup on today. I had to put some jewelry on. And so I want to share this stuff with you all. And hopefully there's a few women who are listening in. My beautiful wampum jewelry. And I want to tell you who made this, Elizabeth Perry. And if you don't mind, she's Wampanoag. And I am going to pull up her website real quick here, if you don't mind. And if you get a minute, take a look and check out her website. She's got some beautiful stuff there. That's the one I want with the rectangular. So if anyone's wants a gift, yeah, there you go, right there. Elizabeth Perry's great. I love her things, and she's probably got more than what she's got up on her website. So be sure to, I always tell people, if you need to buy something, man, we've got wonderful Native artists.
We should start making sure that we list all of those people's websites on the show so that we can have them all, you know. Yeah, since we don't have sponsors, we may as well, you know, show all of our good people's stuff, you know.
So. Buy Indian tags on there. Yeah, we absolutely should. And you know, Roy, we were famous for like 15 minutes today. Were you aware of that? Did you see? I'll pull it up here.
Are you going to read it?
I'm going to read every single word. No. But on Native News Online.
Look at that picture of me. Are you kidding me, right? Like, look at you. That's like the word of, like, they pull a video down. It's video. You can like stop it at a point where I'm not doing some stupid stuff like this, right?
I did that.
I bet you did.
Because I look pretty good there, right?
Don't make me pull up your picture here. Don't make me pull it up and put it on the background.
A great article. Thanks so much, Native News Online, for doing a story about the show and kind of what our thinking about the show was and a little bit about who we are. It's a really great article. And do you remember our interview with their new intern? Do you remember?
Yes, I do.
Michaela?
Yep.
Who had a beautiful story, and we want to get her on our show at some time.
Yeah, she has a great story.
After her internship at Native News Online, we'll bring her on and talk to her about how it went.
Nice young lady. Very nice young lady.
Yeah, so it was a great article. Thank you, Michaela, and folks over there at Native News Online, Levi Rickert, wink, wink. And then the only other thing is I wanted to recognize what today was. And also I kind of want to mention what's happening tomorrow. You know, today is Juneteenth. It's Freedom Day. And Trump was going to appear in Tulsa today, but moved it off a day. There was a really good article put out by the Atlantic that I'm bringing up now. If you have a minute, it's great history about Tulsa and Oklahoma. And am I sharing it yet? There it is. A beautiful history about Black Americans as well as Native Americans in the Tulsa and Oklahoma area throughout time. And basically the area where Trump's going, what the history of that land is, where he'll be standing tomorrow. It's a really excellent article by Rebecca Nagel. And so if y'all get a chance to read it, it was in Atlantic, I think today. Yeah, I think it was published today. So check that out, and just letting folks know we stand with Black Lives Matter and with the celebration of Juneteenth today. You got anything from your neck of the woods about that? Or I'm talking about my wonkish detail.
So they called you wonky and put a funky picture of me up. Okay.
Yeah, news
But
online.
it was nice. It was a very nice article, and it was cool to be on the front page of something for for once. So that was cool. My 15 seconds of fame.
Yeah, no, it was a great article.
Appreciate that.
But
So I want to recognize Juneteenth also,
thank you.
and I understand it's an important day for Black America, and I have mixed feelings about today. Not any to do with what today stands for. It's important and it's meaningful, and the tragedy of slavery and all of those things are, and the echoes of it that exist today are still prevalent. And of course, we need to stand up against those things. And I'm so glad to see so many different people of different colors out there supporting the movement, and recognizing today and recognizing what's going on. And today is probably not a really good day to speak to this, but in a way, as an Indian, as a native of this land, and as a recipient of the atrocities of all of the eons of destruction that we've seen. I don't know if that's the right word. It might mean more time than I'm actually talking about, but the 500 plus years of slavery, our cultures and lives have had to deal with, and the aftermath of it. I'm a product of what that system has done to Native America, and I'm wondering, this morning when I was contemplating about this, today's been one of those days where just a lot of things have kind of hit me sideways. But as I was contemplating this morning, I was like, it's beautiful that they're standing up. And I saw on the TV, I saw the different colored people that were out there with the Black Lives Matter groups, and how the other narrative, the opposite side of the story, is losing its traction, and they're losing this battle that they're fighting against. And things are changing very, very quickly. Very quickly, things are changing. Like, you've never seen a police officer go to jail like 2 days after he's done something like this. It's usually brushed under the rug. We never hear about it again. That police officer got off without, any reprimand at all, because they couldn't find some reason, and now all of a sudden, this horrible event happened where a man was shot in a parking lot, and the very next day, the chief of police quits. And then the day after that, warrants were released. And the day after that, the men were in jail. That hasn't happened before in our history. So to see that changed as rapidly as it has been, it gives me hope. However, how many Indian men and women are missing, have been killed by police, have been killed by tribal police, have been killed by, or just missing, never to be seen again, in unmarked graves in the deserts. How many Indian people have been, trampled on, and over the 500 plus years of what has happened to Native America. When are people going to stand up for us like they're standing up for everyone else? So I'm seeing this as an opportune time for exactly the numbers. The numbers don't lie, but the narrative isn't out in front like it is right now. And I'm glad that the narrative is out there now. However, we should, as Native people, capitalize on this moment in history and get our story heard also. I saw we had Walter Ruiz on. He's AIM's Santa Barbara local chapter in Southern California of AIM, and he he's out marching with Black Lives Matter. So the Native community is supporting, their cause. And he was actually, I saw him on TV the other day, and they were out there. AIM was marching, in LA. So we're supporting it. When is our story going to get out in front of it, and stand next to, Black America and the fight that they're having? Because the numbers prove that, we're just as big a recipients of this atrocity as they are. So I think somebody needs to bring that into the narrative that, Native America deserves a look at this also. And it may, just by osmosis, it might change, what happens in Indian country also. However, for some reason, I doubt it. I think somehow we're going to fall through the cracks again. So I'm at a really strange place with this. Like, I get it. I'm happy, and it's happening, and there's things going on quickly. But please, people, don't let us slip through the cracks. Make sure that we capitalize on this. Make sure that Native America is part of this, and that we don't miss out, and that a year from now the numbers are still what they are. You know what I mean?
Right. And let me just add, Roy, that these numbers haven't been a secret. The fact that Native Americans are more likely to be killed by law enforcement than other racial or ethnic groups is not a secret. The report that I have up right now is actually from 2017. And the law enforcement research and the other reporting, it's been out there for quite some time. And it really digs at you, the fact that, and it's really hard to work in Indian country because you feel like you're not gaining traction.
Yes.
We've been arguing the same arguments. We've been trying to protect our sacred sites. We've been trying not to get killed by law enforcement. We've been trying to do so much, and it seems like it's very slow. And so it really is going to take all of our energy. And I think the fact that this is no longer just a people of color issue, that other that non-Indians, that people of non-color, the people like skin like me, are getting involved, and I think that's just what it's.
Yeah. I don't want to get. This is a great conversation. We need to have this.
So now you're just cut me off.
No, I'm not going to cut you off, because I don't want our guests to not get involved in this same conversation, because he's sitting there waiting patiently, and we've been waiting to get Santee on. So I'm going to bring him up and let you introduce him. So without any further ado, here is our new friend, Santee.
Yeah, let's bring Santee, who got an MFA from Syracuse University. He is the director at the IAIA, Institute of American Indian Arts. And he's the director of the creative writing program there. He's a great guy. I've known him for quite a while, especially through his work. And welcome, Santee.
And he's got a badass camera, and I'm jealous.
Look how great he looks. That lighting.
Thank you. I was working on the lighting, so it took hours to kind of get the right setup, I think. And the reason why is mainly because I have to run a digital residency through the month of July. So I just try to get the setup, ready for that. And, but thanks for having me on, Shannon and Roy. I think, I've been watching a few of the episodes over the weeks, and I'm really excited to kind of have an interesting conversation, especially in regards to some of the things that you had mentioned, in regards to the sort of the blatant sort of, I guess, ignoring Native issues, and especially, issues of violence and systemic racism in the United States, which has been going on for us, since before, before the United States was even a country, before, right from the beginning of Spanish conquest, right? We've been dealing with, that particular ideology. In some ways, that racist ideology was invented and experimented on us from the very beginning. And one of the things, and that I wanted to kind of add to that is that we actually have many Native scholars that have contributed to examining and analyzing, systemic racism in the past. And I don't think that a lot of the times that those scholars, get a lot of recognition whenever you hear, stories on racism, or if you're asked to look at, specific books or reading recommendations. Very rarely are there indigenous and Native scholars or thinkers that are kind of added to that particular conversation. And so one of the scholars, a Haudenosaunee scholar, John Mohawk, I wanted to kind of, bring him into the conversation with this, and just as a, to bring in this sort of a Native or indigenous intellectual into this. And he has an amazing essay, and I reference this essay a lot because I think it's foundational, right? If you're looking at the way that the Native is looked at, or the way that the Native is held in the Western imagination, right? This essay has this essay can kind of give you a better idea as to why we are treated the way that we are, why we're ignored in a lot of contemporary, issues and things like that. But it's the essay itself is called "Racism and American Ideology," and I think that he has some really interesting claims here, and I'll just go into one of the quotes, where he discusses the process of exploitation and genocide with their concurrent ideologies of racism and progressivism are not simply historical happenings from the distant past. And we know this, right? Because we see, right, the protests in the streets. We see all of these things that are happening. And I think he makes a good point here, and especially in relating it to Natives. Those processes are alive and well in the Western Hemisphere today and form the paradigm for all relationships between Native people in the Western world. And I think it's really interesting where he says racism, right? Where I think he's in the essay, he's sort of talking about that one race has biological superiority over another. And then there's progressivism, where the civilization, right, the pursuits of America, right, are also disruptive to Native people. Right. So we see this, right, with the, the removal of, the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes. Right. They needed those particular areas, right, in the United States, right, to progress, right, the American economy. So at that point, Native people were removed as a result of that. Right. So I think that those ideologies, or those two sort of streams of thinking, right, are still sort of alive and well in the United States today. If we think about, the way that Natives are sort of portrayed in books, the way that we're portrayed throughout history, those types of things, right? It's definitely, still in this sort of very raw, primitive state, right? When we look back at Natives and things like that. And so that essentially shapes the way that non-Native people, or see us, right, even before we even meet them. We're not contemporary people. We live in the past, that kind of thing.
But who's writing those stories, and what are they basing their understanding of indigenous peoples on?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because sometimes it's actually Native people that are writing those stories, which is one of the things that I try to instill in the students at the Institute of American Arts MFA and Creative Writing program. Sometimes it is Native people, right? Because those are the stories that we're taught, right? When we're going through, high school, when we're going through undergraduate studies, a lot of the times, at least what I was exposed to, is I was exposed to a lot of literatures that were written by non-Native people, And then you would see at certain parts in Native literature where those particular types of narratives and ideas about the natives were mimicked by actual, by Native people themselves, right? Which is kind of interesting. And Mohawk kind of talks about this a little bit in this same essay, where he says, modern colonialism requires that the Native people participate in their own exploitation. In North America, many of the vestiges of Native freedom in the form of Native government and economy have been forcibly eradicated. In place of the traditional or natural world forms of government and society are Native administrators of the traditional or natural world forms of government and society are Native administrators of colonial policies. People who have been educated, trained in the skills of the oppression of their own people. And I think this is definitely true, right? He's talking more about, sort of government organization, that kind of thing. But I think this is definitely true in literature, where we learn how to tell stories, right, that are palatable to non-native Western audiences, right? And we tour guide them, right, throughout, in a novel, right? These are natives. This is an authentic native texts, right? So even though something might be fiction, right, oftentimes in native literature, those things are written as if they're nonfiction, right? As if they're true to life, that this is a sort of an accurate portrayal of how natives live. But if you look at native fictions, right, written by native and non-native people in the past, right, if you look at those and examine them and compare them to non-fiction texts, right, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and others, you'll see those same literary mechanisms, right, and descriptions of native people running throughout both. And so sometimes it's very hard to see in native literature the difference between fiction and nonfiction, right? I think today, though, we're having some interesting conversations and discussions on these particular issues that are primarily led to me, or at least in my opinion, by the author of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, David Troyer, where he attempts to write a history of Native people since since Wounded Knee. Right, he tries to write a history that is actually more uplifting and positive, right, and talking about Native survival, things like that I think is really interesting, because it's a way of sort of reclaiming, right, our identities, right, through literature. And he kind of talks about it a little bit in the intro, and I have a quote here. The usual story told about us, or rather about the Indian, is one of diminution and death, beginning in untrammeled freedom and communion with the earth, and ending on reservations, which are seen as nothing more than basins of perpetual suffering. This book is a counter-narrative to the story that has been told about us, but it is something more as well. It is an attempt to confront the ways we Indians ourselves understand our place in the world, our self-regard, the vision and versions we hold of who we are and what we want and what we mean matter greatly. And so one thing that I find, sort of uplifting about that particular book is that, the first part of it, he goes through Native histories by region, right? Very dense, right? But it's definitely written for a non-native, but it's not attempting to be, it's attempting to educate rather than to be palatable, rather than to engage the imagination, which I think is a very different thing.
Right.
And then he sort of goes into this in the other parts of the book, is looking at Native life from a very contemporary point of view, but not as a tragedy, but as this sort of, this sort of story of survival and the things that we've had to do to, to build our nations, to build, language programs on Native nations, to the efforts that we have, as all Native people, Native nations in this country, the efforts that we have put into our youth, to our intellectual property, to our artifacts, and those kinds of things. And those positive stories don't often get told, I feel, oftentimes in literature, oftentimes in nonfiction, those kinds of things were kind of left to this sort of remnant, right? This sort of subaltern status, right? Of an era, of a era of the past in the United States, right? And now we've all become assimilated, and we've all sort of adopted this other way of life, and so on and so forth. But I really think it's interesting, that there's this sort of new sort of movement in Native literature right now that seeks to give us dignity, for one. and that seeks to sort of, counter, right, or at least reshape the non-native Western imagination, right, when it comes to Native people, and especially in literary arts. So I always just kind of want to offer that. And it's like, I was a faculty member before at II MFA before I was the director. And one day I was sitting there, and we were in a panel, right? And there were 4 or 5 authors that were up on the stage, and they were discussing or giving advice on political texts, right? And these were all non-native mentors, and not one of them, even though we're on a native, we're on a tribal college campus, not one of them mentioned a book by a native author in regards to any sort of intellectual sort of offering or political perspective, right? Even though we had a huge library not maybe 200 steps away that contained all of these works, right? And so that's a common colonial sort of tension, right? Where you have people that are non-native coming into native institutions thinking that they can educate us, right? That's the progressivism that John Mohawk talks about, that we don't have anything to offer and that we are a blank slate and we need the help of others, right? In order to exist in this, in contemporary America or something like that, which I always find quite offensive, to be honest. And
exactly
your points, right? And the way that our issues and our ideas and our perspective get ignored in this country is often, right? You see it if you're a native person and you're watching the news every day and you're paying attention on Facebook and all these things, you often see that, right? That our issues
and we learn how to stuff it down, like
yeah,
we learn how to just and that's their issue. Well, no, it's our issue too.
Well, we've bought into it. I mean, we've created we're stuck. We're stuck in, we're telling these stereotypical stories that have been told about us by others. It seems, and this new movement in literature to retell the story. I mean, it's what I think we've all been waiting for. If we're ever going to heal from historic traumas, we've got to take our narrative ourselves, and
we got to take it back.
Yeah.
It's got to be taken back.
I mean, is that what you're thinking, Santee?
Wait.
What?
We're getting deep into this, and we don't even know who Santee is yet.
I know, that's where I was going.
I'm gonna stop him and bring him back. We want to know about Santee, because that's what we do here. We want to know who you are and why you're this prominent voice, because you're a prominent voice, and you're intelligent, you speak well, you talk to the issues. And we need to know who you are, where you came from, what developed your mind into having these type of ideals versus, what Shannon was talking about. Some of us who have bought into, the idea that it's, that's just the way it is,
right. Well, I'm originally from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, northeastern part of Oklahoma, which is essentially the capital of the Cherokee Nation.
Oh boy.
It's really interesting. I grew up in all of my family members on my mom's side were all fluent Cherokee speakers. So that was my first language, even though I can't speak it now. I can't claim to speak it now. And I have ideas about language too. I always think that language should be spoken among the people and not, because it has practical purpose. But so that was my first language growing up. But also, a part of that was, my family were laborers at this plant nursery in the area called Greenleaf Nursery, and all the natives essentially worked there, which was about raising plants, and they would be shipped off to various parts of the country and sold and that kind of thing. It was a minimum wage job, a lot of outdoor work. It was right across the road from Ten Killer Lake. And so, that's where my grandfather worked. That's where my grandmother worked. That's where my mother worked. And my mother was, by the way, 15 when she gave birth to me. So, I was a product of teenage parents. They met at Sequoia High School, and, 9 months later, I was born. And so, a lot of the dysfunctions, a lot of the issues associated with poverty, those kinds of things that we hear about natives, I actually experienced all of those things. My families on both sides, my mom and dad's sides, were at the ends of different threads of oppression that have been enacted on Native people. My father's side of the family from Oklahoma City, they were relocated to Kansas. They're Potawatomi, Prairie Brand Potawatomi. They were relocated to Kansas, and then eventually that family moved to Tulsa. A part of his family, they were sign painters, blue collar type workers, right? Typical Indian Relocation Act, IRA, right? Initiatives where you would put Native people in urban centers, and then they would pick up a trade, right? And then they would, essentially assimilate, right? That was the sort of the cultural genocide, right? That we witnessed back then, moving people out of native nations, putting them in an urban context. And essentially, in order to survive, you have to learn, another way of living, or another, another culture, right, in order to survive. And so very rarely you see Native people in those particular environments going back to their home culture, which I find quite concerning, but it's kind of maybe a little bit off topic. So me growing up, I grew up very poor, in and out of different boarding schools, kicked out of boarding schools, I moved out on my own when I, around the age of 16, held a full-time job, cooking, and doing a lot of other, working in kitchens. When I turned 16, I got a job immediately, which was at McDonald's. And then I picked up a second job right after that, which was at Taco Bell. So I was essentially work around the clock at McDonald's and Taco Bell. I was always at one of those two places in Oklahoma City. And then eventually I got jobs in kitchens in the Oklahoma City area. Finished high school. I had a very good English teacher my senior year of high school, Gail St. John, who was very supportive of my ability to, read texts and understand them, talk about metaphor. I always had a talent for reading subtexts and literatures and things like that. And so from then I kind of got this idea that I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be a fiction writer at first, because, that's always the sort of the more glossy sort of path in literature, is to do fiction. And so eventually I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1999, where I had two professors, John Davis and Arthur Z, who are both poets, and they convinced me to be a poet. And so, I was really sort of interested in the art form, and some of the ideas, conceptual sort of, ideas that and philosophies and things like that are kind of running throughout poetry. And, I kind of made up my mind then that I wanted to be a poet, but I didn't want to be a native poet, which is kind of an interesting and odd thing, because I am a native person. So I can't help but be anything other than what I am. But I felt like on the page, in writing poems, I didn't have to be the tour guide, or I didn't have to be the person that introduced native life to non-native readers, is that I could actually practice art. And to me, that was freeing, right? Because it's an individual process, right? And looking at specific, the way that, a specific word impacts a line, or the way that, a specific type of form of a poem works, or the way the page works, those kinds of things were always really very interesting to me. And, but also poetry is a art form of constraints, right? You have ideas about art and how it's supposed to function, how ideas about how poetry is supposed to function. And that essentially shapes your identity as a poet. And one of the things that I said that I would never do, and I haven't, is using, political signifiers in my work, like the word native or Indian, or any of these things, that I wanted to craft essentially a native experience on the page without having to give into, that sort of political language, right? Because those words, those phrases that are used to describe native people, even though I have to use it in order to, make sense to the audience, those signifiers and those labels were given to us, right? They're prescribed to us in textbooks a lot of the times, right?
Mhm.
And so,
which is
I
why they're
wanna
always
engage-
so uncomfortable for me to speak. I'm always uncomfortable when I'm saying them.
Yeah. Yeah. So so that's kind of what, and so since then I've been trying to write, poems and trying to keep my integrity as an artist and those kinds of things, while at the same time trying to be involved and aware of Native people living in Native communities and still living in their Native nations and trying to do work within their Native nations, right? So, because just like the IRA that I mentioned earlier, the Relocation Act and the moving of Native people out of their communities, right? Education kind of played that same role, right? Where Native people would get educated, right? They would get a better job, but they would never go back to their communities. And I think that's one of the histories of Native education and so I'm really interested in, especially being a part of the IAI MFA program, is that I'm really interested in trying to get writers to understand that they can go back into their communities and serve a purpose and do real work, right, in those communities, maybe in literacy and those kinds of things, as opposed to, writing a book about your people, right, but never really returning to that place, right, to do the work that you need to do. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of happened over the years, the way that we have been oppressed, right? We've been taught that our homes and that our communities are places to escape, right? But what we really need to do now in terms of, nation building and to make sure that, that we continue to survive and our cultures continue to, be vibrant, right? We need to, make sure that we have a way of bringing, people back, right? And we want, and I always try to instill that, right, in the, in our little literary community, right? And I think that that's one of the values, right, that I'm constantly trying to sort of beating everybody over the head with, is that you can make a living as a writer.
Yeah. So how have you done that, Santee? How have you kind of kept yourself in culture, and how did you come back in? I mean, even if you're not speaking Cherokee, what are you doing?
Well, I don't do it in the work, right? I can't claim
Right,
that it's in the poems, right?
right.
And so that's one thing that I would say that I don't do it in the poems.
Can you talk a little bit about your poetry, or can you read something for us so that folks get kind of a flavor of where you're coming from with your work, and then talk about, then who are you as a Native person? If you're not doing Native poetry, right? If you're not doing Native, then how are you connected? How do you stay connected? Does that somehow cut you off, or does that somehow give you less credibility, more credibility?
But he can't separate himself from Native poetry
Right.
because he is Native poetry, no matter what he says.
Well, let's.
Well, it's an interesting thing. That's an interesting tension that you bring up, So, one of the things that I've always sort of believed in terms of activism is that one of the most radical forms of activism is raising good Native kids, right?
Right.
That are connected to their culture, that have an understanding of who they are and are proud of who they are, and that can go through life, right? Thinking about themselves in a positive way. So I have 2 young children. I don't like to go into too much of my personal life, and one of the things that is really important to me is that they get a chance to be, and Diage Alfred, Mohawk scholar, kind of talks about this in one of his talks about practical decolonization, is that we have to give younger generations a chance to be more indigenous than we had the opportunity to be. Right. And so we have to create those, an opportunity for them to learn their language, to learn, culture, those kinds of things, and also to give them a real childhood, which I didn't have either. Right. Another thing that I feel like I'm always sort of tracking in Native communities, everywhere I go. I'm never, whenever I leave New York, Onondaga territory here, and I go to New Mexico, I have a half brother who is Santa Ana Pueblo, so I'm in with my Pueblo family after that. And then when I go to Navajo Nation, I have Navajo family there, and I know people in all in all these different Native communities, right? And one of the things that I feel like what people don't understand about Native communities, and especially whenever you hear the sort of reference to Native people, is that one of the best ways to acknowledge Native people also is to go and to be in those communities and to learn about the people and to be with them, right? And so that's one of the, so that's kind of, my life has always been, in and around Native communities, even in boarding school, things like that, it was all Native boarding schools, that kind of stuff. And to me, my poetry and my art is a place where I am unrestricted, right, by political shackles, if you will, right? I have a chance to be an artist. And so in a way that we have to give kids the opportunity to be kids, we also have to give artists and writers and things like that an opportunity to be artists, right? To transcend some of these sort of these definitions, right, that we put on Native writers, Native, painters, those kinds of things, right? And that's kind of the ethos of IAIA, right? The founder, Lloyd Kivanu, who was also of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, he felt that IAIA was a place where the artist is unrestricted. They have the right to be creative and do their own work. And they weren't just relegated to do folk art, right? They could do fine art if they wanted. And so I have some poems. I don't know if I'll be able to share my screen, but I have a couple of poems here. But I like to read this one called Lacta Fication, which is the frontis poem to my most recent book, Aurum. And it's lactification is a term that was created by Frantz Fanon. And it was, the action itself is literally the whitening of skin, but it's also about the language that's created around and centered around race, right? So, just when I was mentioning John Mohawk, right? In that essay, he discusses how Natives were discussed in Spain, right, before conquest, right, and the language that was used, right, to describe Native people back then. And once in the English language and in other languages, especially too, once a specific type of lexicon or language is invented, right, especially when describing a specific type of people, it's essentially impossible to eradicate it. Right. So lactification in some ways kind of messes with that as well. Now, the poems themselves, I like to write with sound in mind. So just kind of keep that. There's not going to be it's not really a narrative poem, but it's sort of this sort of description of the word lactification. Taught to gnaw, to take a switch across the arches, a worming sort whose armpits smell like mustard. Strike behind his ear, forearms lashed and etched, a bulbous fist strung with muscle. Nose misshapen, fungal curds over a frown ribbed and chapped. Nubbin that sounds like clavicle, pocked. A slurry of vice, a tally of kin. A breath or smother that utters moth wings sapped to kindling. From a world stricken with slog and all manners of knifing. A scuttle of Aurum, a smattering of ochre between the chomps and fangs, torquing his wrists from shackle. A culling of melanin, his skull ensconced in choir song. A tail of wiry locks, a hank of charred skin. So that sort of talks about this. So you can kind of hear this sort of, it's a very gritty poem, but it's a sort of about this figure of the Native male, right? Where it's this misshapen sort of figure of the Native male at the ends of these sort of different threads of oppression, right? And so I want those things to be in the poem, but I don't want to describe them directly, right? I want a sort of a tone or a sound in the poem that kind of gets you to that place, right? That sort of sense of existence, but to explain it overtly or directly, it sort of is counterproductive to what a poem is supposed to be, right? And so that's kind of, so that kind of opens the book and sets the whole sort of, the different threads and through lines in the book into motion, right? And so the sort of the native male as this vaudeville performative figure, right? The native male as a blue collar worker, the native male as an alcoholic, the native male as, associated with the history of violence, right? And we see these images in the book kind of repeat throughout.
Yeah. So, so you don't have to, if you're Native, you don't have to do Indian art. You don't have to do Indian literature. You don't have to do powwow dancing. You can do whatever you want. So what do we do when non-Indians use that same logic on us? Well, we're spending time in your communities. We're telling your story. What do we do with that side of that?
Yeah,
if we can go into their world, why can't they come into ours?
Well, I think that's, it's really difficult because the every Native nation has its own political situation. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize. Everybody thinks that we're in the same political situation as Lakota people because they were they're the most recent in history, right? But so I think that, going into different Native nations and participating in those Native nations, a lot of the times, I think one of the differences is we were forced to engage in Western culture. We didn't have a choice, right? They get to make the choice. They have the privilege, right? To come in there,
assimilate. Yeah, we were told to assimilate.
Right. So I think where our agency lies, right, as Native people now, is that we have the opportunity to reshape that, right, to reshape our stories, right, and to, for lack of a better sort of metaphor, is to draw the line, right? It's like, this is kind of where we stand. This is what Native literature is. This is what, Native intellectualism is. This is, and sort of, instead of that being defined for us, or having someone come and teach us those things. We can do all of these things ourselves. We just have to convince ourselves in some cases that we can do it, right? To have the dignity, right? And the agency and the gumption to do it. And I think there are a lot of people out there that are doing that type of work. And that's why, as a writer, I never want to diminish the type of work that people are doing on Native nations every day. I'm writing poems in a room, right, in an apartment, and yeah, I could make these political poems that are overtly, that speak to different issues, but I always remember too that, and kind of to Roy's point at the beginning, I could write about missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Not my place, I know that, but I could, just hypothetically, I could, but there are actually people living in Native nations every day that are doing that work. And as a writer, right, as a literary artist, I don't want to diminish that work that they're doing, right? I can't claim to be doing that work because there are, right? Every day there's a person that goes and teaches language class every day to their people, right? And that's real work. And I could put Cherokee syllabary and I could, do all of these things and call myself a language activist, but am I putting that into action in everyday life? I'm not doing that. I'm writing poems, but I feel like where I do have, some ethos is, promoting those specific ideas, right, and that direction in this creative writing program, which is, 83% Native, and Native nations from all over the country, and I think one of the things too is that we're a low residency program, and it's such a really good model for Native people because, a single mother can come to our program and get an MFA because they don't have to move from their family. You only come to Santa Fe twice a year. Right now, not at all because of the pandemic, obviously. But that's one of the things, right? It's the low residency model is perfect for Native people because they can leave home for about a week, then they can return home and still keep doing their work and get a degree. And that's really important to me. And so, I always just want to make sure that people really understand, right, the differences, right, and what literature is for and how it works and how to have integrity as an artist.
Roy, ask a question, because this has been really good. I really appreciate what you're talking about, Santee.
Thank you.
So when you were younger and you were going through all the things that you went through, what drove you into becoming a poet, a writer, an intellectual on the topics that you're looking at? What drove you to that? Because if you were in and out of boarding schools and all this, you were headed to the streets like I was. So what turned you onto the intellectual path, I guess I would like to say.
Yeah. And I was headed for that. I mean, I'd struggled with substance abuse. Like a lot of my family, my mother passed away of, essentially of liver failure. Many of my family, in and out of institutions, correctional facilities, that kind of thing. And, one of the things that, I experienced, when I moved out on my own is that I realized that I could, essentially shape my life into what I wanted it to be. And, and working in kitchens and doing those kinds of things, just kind of having that sort of own isolated time between the ages of 16 to about 20. I had a lot of luck meeting good people, and again, I bring her up again, but my senior English teacher, Gail St. John, was one of the sort of major influences in her class. I was in her normal English class, and she asked if I wanted to attend the AP class, which was the advanced class, at Norman High School way back when. And they were reading the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which is a terribly complicated book. Still one of my favorite books to read. And the way that Ellison dealt with race and issues of race, right, in that particular era of America was so fascinating and interesting to me. And so I essentially wanted to do that kind of work, but sort of from a Native point of view. But what ended up happening was the intellectual part of me going through research and reading things and essentially just trying to decipher and deconstruct my own oppression, right? To understand why I am the way I am and how, the system, right? The system within the United States, the culture in the United States shaped me into who I am, right? And those kinds of things. And the more and more I read that, and I read post-colonial critical theory, those kinds of things, I started to realize that the Native literature in some instances, not all of them, but some instances is actually one of the tools of oppression, right? Storytelling is really impactful, right? And it was really interesting. We were Game of Thrones fans until the last episode, but there was a one part in one of the seasons where Jon Snow says, the wildlings will never win because we've already written stories about how we'll be victorious over them every time, right? And that's one of the functions of literature, right?
Right.
And that's the way that literature has shaped Native people, right? That's why in some cases maybe we are defeatists, right? Fatalistic, right? Sometimes, and because that's the books that we read.
Right.
But I didn't actually read any Native literature until I went to IAI. It didn't have a profound influence on my life. And then when I did read Native literature, a lot of it didn't resonate with me. Some did, I won't, but a lot of it didn't because it was an experience that was unfamiliar to me. Right. The way that the natives were portrayed in literature and those kinds of things, I just didn't see that. I saw, Terry Friday, my boarding school roommate, right, that got his teeth knocked out, or something, my understanding of who natives were and that kind of thing just wasn't in those books, right? And so I wanted to write a literature that, that is more representative of where I come from.
Mhm.
Right? I don't know if that's quote unquote real Native life or any of those things. I can't claim to that, but those are my experiences, right? And so that's kind of the thing, right? There's a shame that Native people experience about their circumstances, but a lot of the times that shame is rooted in systemic oppression. And how do we escape that, right?
Exactly.
As writers, how do we escape that as literary artists? And how do we deconstruct that for our readers, which shouldn't be non-Native readers all the time, which should be Native people reading our work, right? Because we should be doing that community work all the time. But I think, again, in some ways, right, the way that the Indian education was shaped, right, pulling people out of out of their homes and go to boarding school, those kinds of things, that attitude was still very prevalent in the 80s and 90s whenever we would, you see the rise of indigenous studies programs and Native literature and those kinds of things. That was still the prevailing attitude in Native literature, right? Remove the Native from their home, we educate them, right? And then we have a whole set of knowledge system, right? That is rooted in in Western ideologies and thinking, right? That defines what the Native is in institutions of higher learning, right? And then we're still not defining ourselves, right? Certain group of people are defining us, right? But I find if you go through and look at a lot of those texts, right? Those are a lot of thinkers and scholars and things like that were actually not operating in their communities, right? That's a colonial act. So that's what, I always reference, Vine Deloria and John Mohawk and those kinds of scholars, because they are always, they remained active in their communities. They worked from their communities, which I think is highly important. And there's a lot of people doing that work today. For instance, Ryan Redcorn, who was a part of the 1491s, he worked specifically within the Osage Nation and decided to stay there because he wanted his daughters to learn Osage and he wanted to be a part of that culture. He could have went anywhere and made a living, right? But he decided to stay home. And we need more people that decide to stay home, right? And to uplift their communities. And so, that's kind of my thinking, right? I didn't live an optimal sort of, I didn't have all these opportunities, right? I always look at everything from the lack of opportunity and how can I facilitate that for other people? But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
Well, you said that there's some kind of I forget the word you used. You didn't use embarrassment, but you said
shame.
The shame. But that's why I like to talk to everybody and get to hear their story, because we're so fractionalized. When you take, we talk about things like sovereignty and culture and language, and all of those things have been fractured. And all of our people have been fractured. Like my family was fractured from our tribes were fractured from each other. Half of the tribe went to Anadarko, Oklahoma. Half the tribe stayed in Shreveport, Louisiana area. So we were fractured there. Our language was fractured by everybody separating, and has changed and morphed into many different types of languages. So, and on top of that, our families were fractured. For my father was, boarding school, and I was adopted out because of the shame of being, a half-breed Native boy, and my name was changed and all those things. So we all have these stories, and a lot of our I guess Indian country, for lack of better words, is fractured. Now there are, there's still ecosystems that are intact, and in the different reservations and different tribes still have a close community and still aren't as fractionalized as a lot of us are. So a lot of the influence, the artwork, the writing, all of those things come from fractionalized people that, like you said, have that shame kind of in us. So I was interested in hearing that part of you and from all of our guests, if they are part of that, or if they are part of the ecosphere that still is intact. So we all have a different story about what being Native is to us.
Yeah. Well, I think shame is associated with the fear of being primitive, right? Which Mohawk talks about, right? And that's the way that we were described as, the liberal point of view back, before, conquest was that, we were indeed humans, but we were of a primitive culture. We didn't have the things that Europeans had. And then, and so I think that's one of the, that's always going to be an undercurrent for Native people, is that fear of being primitive or being perceived as primitive. Right. And that, that shame and that fear is, runs throughout, it runs throughout race and class and all of these other things. And
you see it in all our institutions, right? Look at how our museums are set up. The primitive art is always on the bottom,
right.
And then it progresses up, right? Through civilization and the different eras of time to modern art, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our laws are based. Our federal law in Indian law are based on the fact that Indians are inferior because they're primitive savages.
Right. So
everything, you're absolutely right, and we've bought into that narrative one more time.
Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to if we're putting that in our own literature, right? If we're describing ourselves that way, that's even harder to overcome, right? And so again, that's why I sort of always appreciated David Troyer's book. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee anyway, because, it at least acknowledges that those things exist, right? Again, I just have to keep reiterating that narrative and story are so important, right? And those, a lot of the times those are things that narrative and myth and all of these things shape our identities, which I think is why, Native creation stories are so important, that kids should learn them at a very young age. Right. Which is why, I think it's important for them to learn our history, but not learn it through textbooks in elementary schools. That's our responsibility. There's nothing we can do about the textbooks in elementary schools, but there is something that we can do about it at home and within our nations. And I think that we have to have more agency and be more empowered to do that. And we have to bring people back, right, our own people back from, and have them come into the communities to do that type of work also.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important. We don't need degrees necessarily, even though I run an MFA program. I don't think we need degrees as much as we need to show, people on Native nations that there are possibilities, right? And we have communal land bases, we have a culture, we have knowledge, we have intelligence, right? And we have really, really good people. And all we need a lot of the times is just that sort of that collective effort, right? It's like, if a school is teaching the wrong history, offer the right history, right? Mm-hmm. In a context that is where it's Native people that are teaching those histories, mm-hmm. right? And also offering that to non-Natives too, to attend as well, right? We don't always have to be in this state of oppression, and we have to accept that oppression and complain about it. I think that these days we do have, we have the agency and the means, right, to deal with those things proactively.
Right. So how much do we push back, though? The thinking, as you were talking about stories and storytelling and myths, I used to get so upset as a kid when people would talk about our stories being myths, because I remember my grandmother telling all these wonderful, amazing stories. And so when someone would associate that with a myth, mm-hmm. something not real, something like a fairy tale, it would devastate me. It would make me so angry. Like, so how much do we push back? How do you push back in the position you're in?
Oh, it's so difficult. I was at a conference in San Antonio a couple months ago, right before lockdown happened. And it's the AWP, it's the Associated Writers Program conference. And I had this banner up behind me, right? You can't really tell that's a Native banner, right? It's just typography. It says, I rewrite the literary landscape, but, there's no feathers or anything like that on there.
Right.
And I leave that kind of iconography off, right? So people don't jump to conclusions, right? There's what does that feather mean? Is that talk, they start asking these weird questions. And so what I noticed was when I was talking to people, they wouldn't have any questions when they came up to our booth. They wouldn't have questions, non-natives mostly. They wouldn't have questions about who, they wouldn't have questions about our program. They would have questions about culture, right? And they would ask me, what does this mean? And it would be something from a completely different culture than my own, or these reductive questions. One guy asked me, he was like, well, literature is a new thing for Native people, right? You guys don't write, right? You do all oral stuff. Talking to a Cherokee person, right? And I was just like, and I didn't have the energy in that moment to teach him all of Native history, which was what he's wanting. I had to blatantly tell him that it was a reductive question and that there are many Native nations, and all have different cultures, and it would be unfair for me to speak for them all, and without trying to be mean. And then another person was asking, well, what, we have also used the Thunderbird, logo, and that was another banner that we had, and so what ended up happening was people would ask about the Thunderbird, right? And they would have some kind of story that they may have heard, or a book they may have read somewhere about the Thunderbird and what it means. But the Thunderbird exists in many, Native cultures, right?
Or it was their spirit animal or something like that, right?
Right. There's always a spirit animal person that comes up.
Yeah.
And like, to me, I think the best thing that we can do is not be offended, and not feel like we have to teach them. It's to have some kind of level of dignity, that it's saying that, and understand that you almost have to treat people like that, like children, right? They don't know the boundaries. They don't know that they're being offensive. And sometimes, right, you can arise at a teaching moment, right, to really get them to understand, right, that how reductive their questions are, or how, essentially, for lack of a better term, how racist they're being in that particular moment. But once you call someone racist, they stop listening to you.
Right.
And so you have to have a delicate way to reach them, right? Because it's really, and I think this is really important, is that, again, if we're implicating ourselves in our own exploitation, we're also responsible for that perspective as well in some cases, right? And so we have to take responsibility for that too. And so, my ideas on these things are always a little bit polarizing, but I think that, one of the things that, if we want people to see us in a different way, then we have to write those stories, and we have to shape that, their imagination, in a way to, to give us more respect and dignity. Right. And because that's what it is, right? They feel like they can ask us anything and we're supposed to answer them.
Right.
And that's the kind of, it's like, well, this sort of sense of servitude, right? Or to be the oddity in the freak show, right? Or to something similar to the Wild Bill, the Wild West show, right? And the way that natives are portrayed in the circus.
Yeah.
And I write about that quite a bit too, and that's sort of the way the native figure is treated in that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what made me so uncomfortable when I was on the Joe Rogan show.
Mm-hmm.
I really felt like I was supposed to somehow answer all his questions. And then some of the questions he asked, I really didn't want to answer. And what that ended up doing is making both of us really uncomfortable, and getting a lot of hate because I wouldn't answer his question.
Mm-hmm. Right. That conversation is so emblematic of the type of conversations that Native people have to have, sometimes on a daily basis.
Oh,
where
yeah.
You have a guy that says, hey, I've read all the books about Natives, so therefore I know who you are, and I have questions, right? It's very sort of paternal also, you answer to me, or I've read these certain types of books, and so therefore I'm knowledgeable. And I really like what you said in a very delicate way. It's like, well, we really have to, we have to find you some new books to read, which I think is important. But we use that podcast in our cultural competency materials, because that is a conversation that we have to have all the time with non-native people, right? And those particular encounters, again, they happen all the time. So it's up to us, right? That's where we play an important role, right? In terms of how we engage, right? For lack of a better term, that type of ignorance, right? We have to have strategies and understandings of how to do that, because we can't just be offended all the time, and we can't just be angry all the time. Yeah.
Right.
It just gets exhausting.
Even though you were, I could see a little bit, you could tell, but it was good.
Well, it's always work, and it's always exhausting to try and just have a conversation without having to answer all of those questions that we don't want to answer or can't answer, or there's no need for them to know some of the things that they ask a lot.
What's interesting about being executive director at the Association on American Indian Affairs is that we get tons of inquiries. A lot of them around ancestry and DNA. And I've always been told I'm Indian. I want to take a DNA test. We even get the calls, I got my DNA test. It says I'm Indian. Where's my Indian check?
Oh, yeah.
There's so many misunderstandings about being Native American in our culture, and all of us. Native and non-native need some help.
Yeah. I'm still waiting on my Indian check.
Yeah,
I ain't got one yet.
But it's really interesting, it's like, again, I go back to that sort of native poet, not native poet, is native poetry and native literature. If it's a subgenre of literature, then there's certain things that you do, a certain way that you write in order to be in that genre. That's what you do in science fiction, right? That's what you do in literary fiction. That's what you do in romance novels, which have a lot of interesting native characters in them. But, so if native literature is a subgenre of literature, right, there's certain expectations, right, that are there. So, but at the same time, I feel like it's somewhat racist to say that just because I'm Cherokee Nation and I'm brown, that I get put in that category, right? But I don't feel like I adhere to that genre, right? It's only because of my race that I'm put in that genre.
Which is a complete social construct. It's not even a real thing.
Right. And I think the sooner we start recognizing those things, the freer we become, in terms of being able to express ourselves in art, also to be thinkers and things like that. And also free ourselves from ignorance, like you're talking about, people wanting their Indian check and being reductive and those kinds of things. But I always think it's always a little bit funny because that's that's like social lubrication. Or native people. It's like whenever you talk about, there's all, every time I say I'm Cherokee, everybody always is like, oh, you're the darkest Cherokee I've ever seen. And it's like, well, not really, because I have family that are like purple. I used to get purple when I was younger, but I'm not anymore. But it's always one of those things, right? Because everybody's Cherokee, right? But then, fake natives or pretendians have gotten pretty creative, and they'll always come up with this sort of obscure tribe or nation that doesn't exist anymore, and so, and talking about that. And then there's all of the stuff about blood quantum and all those other things. It's really hard. I think that, the way that Native people are defined in all levels of life is problematic. And, especially when it's a governmental level with like blood quantum, those kinds of things, in literature, in museums and those kinds of things. And no one's going to fix that but us. We can't ask our oppressors to fix it. We have to do it. And that means that we have to go in and do the hard work on a daily basis sometimes. Yeah.
I think there was an archaeologist at SUNY Oswego back in the day, and he researched and found that there's so many Cherokees because, there was this Cherokee princess that she was kind of got around a little bit.
A lot of bit.
So I'm trying to make a bad joke. See, you're right, Roy. I've got no sense of timing or sense of humor over here. But SUNY Oswego, there were some archaeologists there that were really horrible in the state of New York at what they would do with Native human remains they would find and what have you. But anyway, Cherokees get around a lot. So that's what we always said.
Yeah. I was almost ready to vote for my Cherokee sister, Elizabeth Warren. But thankfully, I didn't have to do that.
But
I just thought you guys got around because everyone I bump into, man, their grandma, she was like, she didn't,
well,
you know what I'm saying?
Bill Clinton said the same thing. He was at a panel with Sherman Alexie, and he actually said that to Sherman Alexie. Oh, my grandmother was a Cherokee princess.
Yeah.
So it's just part of our mythos. But in Oklahoma, particularly, Elizabeth Warren's story was that, it was just always a story, part of the family. She never claimed that she was enrolled. But it's just kind of part of the myth.
Right.
I don't think that makes her bad or a racist. Unless
I think so. I just thought it was kind of funny. I treat it like all of those instances, I think Elizabeth Warren's incredibly smart. And I think she's well-meaning, that kind of thing. I'm really interested, when people want to be Native, I think it's a lot better than people not wanting to be Native or that kind of thing. So, but again, those are teachable moments, and it's really difficult in some cases not to be offended, that's, and we're ignored so much, our issues are ignored so much, as you were saying, Roy, at the beginning, and that kind of thing. It's hard to not, resort to unsavory tactics when you're faced with something like that. Somebody's saying that they're a part of your nation, or someone, recognizes you as a Native person and they say that they're Native, but their experiences are different, or, it's really hard, I think, to do that. And I've come across that quite a bit, just kind of trekking in, higher education and literature and that kind of thing, where you would have a lot of folks that made a career, right, out of saying that they were Native, right, and then later on not being that, or having to change their narrative later, those kinds of things, right?
Right.
And I would be so offended. I would watch a person that's clearly not from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma on the stage telling me who my people were, at the same time claiming, it's just, that's really hard to fight, but at the same time, it's like, well, I could complain, or I could get up on the stage myself at some point and do that work if I needed to. I think that's kind of one of the things that's where we are, and I think, again, that's what, a podcast like this or a live stream like this does. We have to have agency. We have to be able to solve these problems ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. Or at least talk about them amongst each other, and, in hopes that other people are listening, and, get a glimpse of what, being Indian means to all of us individually, because it's not just one person or one tribe's perspective. It's, like I said, it's a fractionalized group of people who all have different unique stories. And before we can all come together and I think heal what has been done. And I don't want to sound like a victim. Somebody said in the chat room, sounds like victimism or whatever. I don't want to sound like a victim, but when it comes to understanding who we all are, we have to understand that everybody's got a different story. Like my story here in Southern California, where I live, and the pan-Indian culture that I'm involved in, which isn't my tribe, is a completely different lifestyle and style than when I go back home to Louisiana, or when I'm in Oklahoma, in Anadarko. There's a whole different, my life takes on a whole different kind of culture when I'm there or when I'm here, or so my Indianness is, or my who I am, changes from the different cultures that I'm involved in. Even on this show, we have a lot of people from different tribes, and a lot of people who come from their own groups, and they look at all of us here and they go, oh, you're a Cherokee, oh, you're a Caddo, oh, you're a Choctaw, oh, what do you really know, or what are you really doing, and what are you really saying? And, well, no, we're just telling our own story, and it's our story. And that's what we all need to get across, is that we all have our stories. We all have the things that touch us and spark us into wanting to do something. What makes us want to write, or what makes us not want to use symbols, but use words instead, and not use Indian symbols. And then somebody else says, well, I use Indian symbols because they're important to us, and that's who we are, and that's our culture. But you know what? We all have different things that trigger us. We all have different things that we're fighting for at different times. You know, there's times when I can make fun of stuff, and then there's times that I get serious about them. But that's just how we are. You know, we're all within the hoop. Like what this is all about is Red Hoop Talks. Everything can be pulled out of the hoop. Anger, happiness, sadness, all of these things are at our disposal. That's how we as a people have been taught that, hey, all of these things are ours. It's a circle. It's all available to us. You know, what is above is below. Those kinds of concepts of how we believe. You know, and there's nothing better, nothing greater, and nothing worse. We're all the same. We're all sacred. And all these things are sacred. So at any given time, I could be funny, or at any given time, I could be serious. And that's who we are as a people. And sometimes that gets confusing to a lot of folks because, you know, like you said, I've had those conversations with people where they'll come up to me and they want to talk to me about their spirit animal and how important it is to them, you know, and there's times when I'll humor them and let them tell me their story so that I can just let them talk, you know, and let them speak. And of course, I have no idea of what they're talking about, or, you know, there's no book for me to tell them what that hawk means to them, and that feather that they found, and that day that their whole life changed because of that, and how they've been researching it and developing it. And this is how can I tell somebody who's, you know, put their whole life around this experience that they've had and they claim it to be native, you know, how can I just crush that in 1 second and say, look, it's full of shit. It means nothing to me. Right. I don't understand what you're talking about, and you're insulting me. You know, so who am I to crush somebody like that? So sometimes I'll just listen, and sometimes I'll say, hey, it's not my place to talk about that. You know, that's a different culture. That's a different way, you know? So, you know, all of these things that you talk about, we've all experienced, but everybody needs to understand that we all have different experiences in it.
Right. Yeah. We're not one homogenous group.
Yeah.
That's for sure. It took me a long time to learn how to live up here in Onondaga. It took me a long time to learn, but you know, that's kind of that's the thing. It's right. That's tuition you pay to be a part of a community, right? You have to learn the people, you have to learn where you are. And I find that a lot of, you know, when I encounter a lot of non-natives, you know, they don't want to learn anything, right? They just want to be told. They just want to be they just want their perspective to be reaffirmed, right? You know, they want us to sort of fit into that specific rigid definition. And I think that's, again, we didn't always have the opportunity to be, you know, to be so dynamic, or, you know, and I think fragmented is a good word for it. But I think at the same time, you know, I also like the term diverse too. You know, we're super diverse people. And I even count that with Native people, beyond the southern border, you know, that, you know, in that context as well, on into South America and those places. I think that that's kind of one of the interesting things, is that there's more of us and we're more diverse than what most people think. Yeah. And one of the things that we have to instill and educate with people, you know, we have to, if we're not teaching people who we are, you know, in the right context, there's sometimes, I just get offended and I just we're not doing that work. Somebody else will. And here's about it. Here's a little PSA for any of our white folk viewers out there that want to know about Native culture or asking about ceremony and things like that. What Lance just said is, let them say that. The more they're confused, the more culture is preserved. I want to tell you all something right now. If you walk up to an Indian person and you ask them, you know, about a ceremony or what's that for, or you're probably going to get some kind of a crazy BS answer, and you're going to take something back home that you don't really want to take home, because if they are sharing those things with you, then you're probably getting sold a bridge in Brooklyn. You know what I'm saying? So my PSA is, don't ask those questions.
if
Roy,
what's
Roy,
that?
you remember what our elder, we have an elder in common, and what he used to tell us about why all these non-Indian people were so infatuated with Native people, and he was a traditional looking, big Native man.
Dakota, yeah.
Hair, yeah. Oh, he was like as Indian as you could get in movies and all sorts of stuff. People would come up to him wanting to be Indian, wanting to learn all of these ceremonies. And he said, how can they not? They're on our homelands, on places that we've buried our ancestors for hundreds and thousands of years. How can they not have dreams about us? You know, they're in the wrong place. They're supposed to be over on that side of the water. So of course they're like infatuated.
They're influenced, yeah.
Yeah,
but what I'm getting at is that
don't realize it.
Yeah, and that's true. That's true. I mean, when you stand on this land, you're influenced by it, and you're influenced by the caretakers of this land also.
Yeah.
So that's why it is so intriguing, and that's why it is such the draw is like a magnet to a lot of them, and some of them and a lot of our friends of Native America are white friends that like to get involved in the culture and like to get involved. They truly do want to get involved, but they tend to ask for things that we don't give when they're asked for. Those things are distributed or gifted by observation of you. I've been invited into many different ceremonies from different tribes and to be part of, but I've been asked. I've never asked to be part of them. Because of the respect I have for those things, and because the respect I have and my invitations into my tribe ceremonies that I've given to others, that's when you're invited. That's when people bring you. So my PSA is, just stick around and listen and watch, and let them listen and watch you. And that's when things are revealed. And that's when people are brought into a family or painted in, we call that sometimes. You gotta tread with Native people differently than you might with other cultures, because, like you said, when people always are coming up to you and asking you about this and asking you about that, it gets exhausting. And most of the time you're getting some kind of a real BS answer, or sending you on a what do they call that? A scavenger hunt.
Well, isn't that what the Pueblo tribes did with who's the guy who was after the gold through the Southwest? Oh, I'm forgetting the story.
But is that Onyate?
Looking for the
no.
But it was one of those Spanish explorers, right? Who was going through the Southwest trying to find the whatever that the gold was. Come on, everybody! Someone
they kept giving them the wrong directions.
And exactly, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, sure, it's that way." And of course, he came back and just killed them all because they didn't go the right directions. But Ponce, I don't know if it was Ponce de Leon or who it was, but
it was somebody like that. I can't remember.
Lance. Was it Coronado?
We can make Spanish conquistadors a homogenous group. It doesn't matter. They were all cutting off feet and inflicting violence, so they don't need a name. I think those are all interesting points, and I think, like, for me, one of the things that I've come to realize is that Europeans and people that come here, they learned more from us than what they think. Right. Yeah. Because we knew the land, we knew how to, agriculture, right. Largely our influence, our horticulture, right. Our knowledge, technology, in a sense, feeds the entire planet. There's so many influences by Native people, indigenous people in this country that just get erased. Right. That also what makes America unique as a nation. Right, often gets erased and overlooked a lot of the times, right? But coming to live here, this isn't, Europe, right? To survive the land, to be here, to live here, they had, those early settlers and, those types of folks, they had to learn a lot from us in order to survive. And, of course, they will never reciprocate that gift, right? They will never, because of that, that sort of that thinking, right, that they were biologically superior, their culture was superior to ours, but they learned a lot from us. And that's one of the things that I always sort of instill, especially in, in my students and things like that. And that, there's a lot that we have given to the planet, right? Even if you look at, food, and I love food, but if you look at, chilies originated in Mexico, right? But you look at the impact that had on Asian food culture, right? Chilies, right? Just hot peppers, right? You look at the impact that it had, especially along the coast and in Thailand and that kind of thing. You look at the impact that the tomato had on Italian cuisine and culture, that kind of thing, right? Especially in, port cities in southern Italy, those kinds of things, right? Those are often things that were, really important, right? In terms of transitioning, this civilization into the, European Western civilization into the modern age. A lot of that is the wealth and the knowledge that comes from indigenous people here in North America and in South America.
Right.
Mesoamerican cultures built their cities on a grid. They had a water system. They had plant filtrated aquifers, those kinds of things. People would, bathe every day, right? Most Europeans didn't do that. There's all these things.
Dirty things.
So there's all these influences that I think people forget, and I think, and also those influences again are what makes, America and this, and even in Canada and Mexico and those places, such a unique, right, culture. It creates a, sort of a unique cosmopolitan sort of culture that all of our knowledge and influences underneath all of that.
Right.
Yeah. Right on. Well, this has been awesome. And I want to kind of start to wrap it up only because we've been going for an hour and a half already, not to cut it off. But what would you like to say to kind of wrap this conversation up about yourself and how you fit into, Indian country and, bring us back around bring us back around the hoop.
I was trying to do that, the last thing that I'd said, but I think one of the things that I think
my timing.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think one of the things that I always want to stress, especially in sort of my perspective and my worldview and that kind of thing, especially in regards to literature, all of these things is, and again, I talked about this several times, is that, we have to stop asking permission and asking for things from the people that have essentially put us through 500 years of oppression. And we have to have the agency, knowledge, understanding, and fortitude to do for ourselves on our native nations, and stop asking for, things that we're probably never going to get, like our Indian check, right? But and I think that's kind of one of the things that I always try to instill in my students. No one's going to write your book. No one's going to write your poems for you. It's always you sitting there in the middle of the night, right? And you have to contend with yourself, right? And you have to do the work that you need to do, right? So if you see things that are wrong, or if you see things that are unfair to you or unjust, then do something about it. But don't ask your oppressor to do it, because all they're going to offer you is more oppression.
Exactly. Right on. Thanks, Santee. It was an awesome talk. It was awesome having you on. And I'm sure that hopefully we'll be able to come around the hoop again, bring you back on and talk some more about something.
It'd be great. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Right on. Thanks for coming, buddy. If you don't mind, would you just kind of hang out for a few minutes?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, cool. I'm going to pull you down and Shannon and I are going to wrap it up.
Wrapping it up, man. We had a lot of comments happening.
I'm going to tell you, I wanted to really quickly throw a shout out to the chat. Thanks, Lance, for getting in there. Patrizia, we've got somebody new in there, and I hope, am I messing up your name? Patrizia. We've got Fred Youngbear in there, was being very active. So thanks, guys. Our show is new. We're on hey, this was kind of a landmark episode. This was number 10 for us, right?
Oh, yes, it was.
Yeah, we hit double digits. We're in double digits now. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in
So,
double digits for a while, and I'm not that excited about it. But no,
and also Sandra and Victoria,
yes,
for being in there, loyal, like day one, episode one, chatters. Thanks for coming, guys. You guys are helping us to make the show go along, and we love the participation. Throw it out there. Whatever you guys want to say in the chat's fine. If you say something stupid, we're gonna pull you out and kick you out or whatever. But
no, we won't.
everybody's saying good stuff. I appreciate it. And sis, do you have anything you want to close up with?
Hey, I want to thank the Association on American Indian Affairs for this show. www.indian-affairs.org, the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. I also want to let you know next week who's going to be on.
Who's that going to be?
An amazing woman, soul singer, songwriter, artist, seamstress, and teacher. She's Pura Fay. She's Tuscarora and Tayano, and I tell you, she has got a powerful voice.
Oh, that's right. You're a big fan.
Yeah, I love Pura Fay. I'm going to be all starstruck. I won't be.
Oh boy!
So you're going to have to ask all the questions.
I will gladly. All right, guys. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks for being on Red Hoop Talk with us, and we will see you all next week. Take care and have a great weekend.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Like, comment, subscribe. Go ahead and say whatever you want in the comments. We dig it. We dig it. Bye-bye.